Okay, on to the new economic policy. So once Lenin, his inner circle, and Russia as a whole emerged out of the Civil War, following its own revolution during the closing acts of World War One itself, Lenin was going to have to turn attention to now studying about peacetime policy for economic development and actually more accurately rehabilitation. And the new economic policy was an effort to do just that. Um, Lenin was a committed Marxist. He wanted to follow Marx's chronological kind of orientation towards the sequence of events necessary to achieve a workers' utopia. In order to do that, Lenin recognized that there needed to be time and space allowed for a limited degree of capitalism and the expansion of the private sector within the Russian economy. Russia was not an industrialized state when Lenin came to power, which was kind of a precursor, a prerequisite for, according to Karl Marx, for the for the communist revolution, the workers' revolution to take place. So Lenin, in this largely agrarian society, realized that he needed to um, allow for or permit conditions for private ownership, capitalism to take place that could then act as a trigger towards this ultimate goal of achieving a stateless utopian workers' utopia. And that's exactly what he begins to do. And it turns out to be measurably successful. The Russian economy does begin to recover. There are signs of kind of the righting of the ship of state, so to speak. But Lenin dies in 1924 in the very early stages of this rehabilitative process. And through a series of turns of events, it's going to be Joseph Stalin who is going to be able to consolidate political power after Lenin's death by removing and or eliminating political rivals. Stalin um, was able to manipulate his way to power. Basically, his rivals saw differences over what direction the communist revolution should take. In his view, Stalin argued that there needed to be the establishing of socialism in one country, as he put it, to get Russia's domestic house in order before proceeding with communist dreams of a global revolution. And this is what really was off-putting to anti-communist factions from kind of the earliest expressions of Marxism and communism as an ideology, is that this was to be a global process, a global revolution to achieve this workers' utopia. But here we are in the mid to late 1920s when Stalin is beginning to emerge as the front runner, and he's saying we're not going to proceed along those lines. We have to get the circumstances, the conditions right and stabilized here in Russia before we talk about an international revolution or international aspects of revolution. Now, not everybody agreed with that. Not all Russians agreed with that. Leon Trotsky was one who was a strong advocate for spreading revolution around the world, and so this was something that Stalin had to deal with, and he did. Um, Political rivals, such as Trotsky himself, were um, in many cases silenced. They were hunted down. In the case of Trotsky, he was hunted down and assassinated in Mexico City. And so Stalin's views here won out. In Italy, we see the rise of an alternative ideology, a turn instead of towards the ideological left and kind of this idea of establishing a workers' utopia. Instead, we see in places like Italy and, of course, Germany, a turn to the ideological right and the installation of fascist regimes. With regard to Benito Mussolini, you can see here that he would be in power from 1922 to 1943. Italy was the birthplace of modern fascism, not typically Germany as we might think. Um, Fascism itself, as an ideology, was predicated along lines of anti-enlightened ideals, basically appealing to what we talked about with the counter enlightenment of the early 19th century or the romantic age, where you're acting more on things like um, passion, intuition, that there's this turn towards ethno-nationalism, that the state was a manifestation of the spirited expression of the people itself. That would be galvanized, synthesized by the fascist uh, regimes or the fascist blocs within the political landscape of um, places like Italy and Germany in particular. It should be noted that there were, kind of fascist-oriented political parties or um, political activists, even in places like Britain and France and elsewhere. Um, they just did not ascend to become the dominant political parties. So fascism was anti-enlightened in its ideals, ethno-nationalist in its approach. It was ultra-conservative when it came to cultural values, and it also was predicated on the idea of what we might call irrationalism or kind of a mob mentality. The idea that the will of the people in its purest expression, um, and its most kind of unrefined expression, you might say, the mob, was to be followed virtually at all costs. Now, with the fascists, what is crucial is to make sure that the mob or the people are getting a certain message. They are moving in the direction that fascists wish them to move. And this is the way the fascist regimes can manipulate the will of the people itself. What does that entail? Well, it means usually, more often than not, a one party state. There would also be a massing of political authority in a centralized government with strict governmental control of business and labor. There would be a concerted restriction of personal liberties. Again, fascists and fascist regimes are not concerned with individual expression or individual rights. The idea is that under fascism, your individual rights would be fulfilled through the public sphere as a whole. That if the country does well, then its inhabitants do well. Its citizens succeed if the state succeeds. And so, state and people are synonymous or they're interchangeable. And as a result, instead of emphasizing difference, the state needed to instill uniformity, which is crucial to um, fascist characteristics. So what does that means maintaining and placing a high degree emphasis, you might say, on maintaining traditions, whether they're cultural or economic or political. So things like language, religion, um, dress, um, things of that nature, even race, as far as homogenization were concerned, would be, of course, a defining characteristic, particularly within Germany itself and also places like Japan under its fascist regime too. In Germany, there was a growing unrest when it came to class distinctions. Um, Reparations that Germany was required to pay um, was not only paid in money, but also paid in seized property, seized territory, plundered natural resources. France, for its part, is going to take part of the Alsace-Lorraine region and bring it under French, within the confines of the French country itself, the French nation. Um, why is that nation? Why is that territory so sought after? Well, it's rich in natural resources, coal, iron, and so when that material is mined, that country reaps the benefits, the economic benefits. Over the course of the 1920s, Germany's economy began to just simply crumble. Um, by December of 1923, one US dollar was equaling anywhere between 343 billion Deutschmarks or 5.72 billion Deutschmarks. First and foremost, it gives you an idea as to how volatile the rate of exchange was for these currencies, but also the ludicrous pace of inflation that was taking place within the German state as well. As a result, when you have economic calamity at such an accelerated rate and such an absurd rate, this means that day to day living is almost nearly impossible. And when people are economically unstable, when they're economically insecure, they are going to turn attention towards voices, political leadership, or voices that are going to be one more extreme and going to have very simplified messages. And this was the case in 1923, which allowed Adolf Hitler and other other National Socialists to acquire a following for themselves. And in 1923, Hitler is going to um, organize and lead or call for a putsch, basically a coup against the liberal democratic government of the Weimar Republic, as it was known. Um, the same government that had signed the Versailles Peace Treaty was now having to deal with runaway inflation and these economic calamities. Hitler is going to blame that government for all of Germany's problems and the German people's problems. Now, in 1923, that coup, that beer hall putsch, it started in a beer hall, and where the National Socialists tried to organize, and that effort was undercut. The putsch, the coup was put down. Hitler and others were imprisoned, and it's during that period of time, that stint in prison, when Hitler's going to write his book Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. This is a rambling account of his plans for um, ideological fulfillment, the kind of the fascist agenda, but also of his plans for Europe more broadly speaking. It laid out his anti-Semitic ideas and the pursuit of them. Things like the establishing of what was known as Lebensraum, kind of living space, roughly translated, where he was going to take over the steppe lands of um, what is today the Ukraine and Belarus and other places under Russian authority at the time, and use that for to open up that land for German settlement. After 9 months in prison, Hitler was released from jail, and he was allowed once again to begin to take up his activities, his political activities, um, and eventually come to oversee um, the affairs of the National Socialist Party itself. In China, we have a revolution breaking out in as early as 1911, which is going to end the Qing dynasty and give rise to the Republic of China under Sun Yat sen, who you can see here in this first image. Sun Yat-sen was a Chinese nationalist. He founds the Kuomintang Party, but he died from cancer in 1925. And by 1927, China would be immersed in civil war, roughly intermittently, I should say, from 1927 to 1949. Now, the Japanese invasions of China um, uh, are going to interrupt that war, and also World War II is going to wreak havoc on that civil war. The two factions that are duking it out as far as the Civil War was concerned were mainly between the Chinese nationalists on the one hand and Chinese communists on the other. But during the conflicts with Japan that are going to overflow into World War II itself, the nationalists and the communists made a temporary truce, a pact of agreement in order to face this common enemy. Between these nationalist and communist forces, however, when the Civil War did rage on, you had the nationalists being led by Chiang Kai shek, who you can see here in the upper corner, and also the communists being led by Mao Zedong, who you can see in the lower right hand corner here. This image, this map of China, you can see where areas of not only China but also Manchuria, which part of China, and the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan itself, falling under Japanese control. Also, this here is Vietnam, which was also under Japanese control during World War II. In Japan, um, we have the home islands themselves largely emerging unscathed from World War One. And in the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s, Japan is going to begin to expand its interests amidst ineffectual international institutions such as the League of Nations. Again, there was poor oversight of international treaties, which allowed Japan to begin to ignore um, the treaties like the Washington Conference coming out of the War of 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, and this allowed Japan to begin to expand its navy, to ignore those quotas placed or capped, placing caps on their naval fleets, and so as a result, Japan begins to engage in an arms race. They also begin to consolidate political power at home, where, on the one hand, Japan's government was going to allow for things like universal male suffrage, which sounds very kind of progressive. It sounds very liberal and democratic. In essence, this was done to undercut radical political movements such as communism itself. That really uh, extremism or potentially communist activities, the Communist Party itself was a direct response to um, appealed to, I should say, the part of society, whether it's Japanese or Russian or anywhere else around the world, that was cut out or deprived of being a participating member of the political sphere, that they didn't have a voice or an alternative in which to express themselves and to feel politically represented and empowered. Japan realized that. The Japanese government realized that, and so they allow the male population to participate in voting. If you want your voice heard, then participate. And the but again, the Japanese state, much like Italy and Germany, recognized that um, it was the important part lay in messaging, lay in getting the public to follow prescriptive types of policies. So if you wanted to extend them the right to vote, that would appeal to their sense of being heard or recognized. But now the government realized if we uh, you know uh, stress a certain message, we can affect the movement and the voting of the public itself to vote and support ideas, kind of nationalist ideas, but also more kind of fascist ideas as well. So this was done. The allowing for universal male suffrage was really done to ensure political uniformity based on a reinforced sense of nationalism. Okay, so you're dictating terms of identity in many respects. On the other hand, the same Japanese government that extended universal male suffrage also passed legislation such as the Peace Preservation Law of 1925, which greatly limited the legal expression of political debate in the Japanese public itself. So, groups calling for replacing the system of government or abolishing private ownership, again, kind of key aspects of a communist-like agenda, were outlawed. Japanese women also gained limited suffrage. They were able to participate in local and regional elections, but again, not out of a sense of trying to fulfill a more liberal kind of ideological agenda, um, and provide for a certain measure of political empowerment, but rather because of the drive to spread political conformity throughout Japanese society itself. That in essence, the government is saying, here is the right to vote. Now, here is now vote in the nation's interest, um, which will be determined by us in many respects, the government itself. So, with domestically within Japan, we're seeing a great degree of uniformity, of homogeneity within the society as far as the political culture is concerned. Internationally, Japan began to expand its territorial holdings, again in the Korean Peninsula, and again you can see here by the map. Um, in 1931, Japan was going to go ahead and seize control of Manchuria, which you can see here is kind of moving off the map in the um, northeastern part of what is today China. The rapid economic developments that are taking place, again, turning attention towards places like the Western world, in the United States and Western Europe. The pace of, of economic activity and expansion, generation of wealth, could not and did not last. We get to the economic collapse starting in the United States, but spreading around much of the world, beginning in 1929. Key factors included speculative kind of behavior within the stock market, a measure known as buying on the margin, in which investors could buy stock with as little as 10 to 20% down. This meant that banks would agree to pay the remainder of what a stock cost at the time the buyer wanted to purchase it. The bank would recoup its fronting the money um, um, by the profits that would be reaped as a result of the price of the stock going up. Of course, that's predicated on the idea that stocks will forever be escalating or rising, which, of course, we know they don't. So people were this is incredibly risky behavior when it comes to investing, and so if stocks began to fall, this meant that there would be the need to repay banks, but the people buying these stocks on the margin and using banks to support their habits of buying stocks, this meant that the people could potentially have to pay for stocks if the margins were called. If the banks begin to say, hey, you owe us this money and you owe it to us today, um, people were buying stocks with money they necessarily didn't have, and with income and profits that weren't guaranteed. And so you can see how this is very much a house of cards, so to speak, when it came to not only investing, but also the economic fervor and activity itself. Added to this and kind of adding fuel to the fire was the practice of laissez-faire economics. The government was not going to get involved in economic affairs. That the United States, by this time, really kind of continued to operate under a mandate of letting the economic uh, sphere operate largely unhindered or unfettered by the political order or government. Again, social Darwinist like principles in effect. Um, Also, another key characteristic was that the U.S. manufacturing industry and the agricultural industry were beginning to overproduce um, goods and kind of stockpile quantities of not only appliances and manufactured goods but also large quantities of food and foodstuffs. Meanwhile, there was a growing underconsumption that was taking place. So on the one hand, you have an overproduction and underconsumption, and as a result, there's going to be this excess inventory that the United States economy could not move. You know, there are only so many mouths to feed within the United States. There's only so many people that want to buy cars or dishwashers or air conditioners or what have you. And because of tariffs were in place, when the United States raised tariffs, other countries raised tariffs on U.S. goods. So the excess produce, the excess goods within the US couldn't really be moved over to foreign markets because they were not competitive overseas. And this gets us into, again, this kind of short sighted, self defeating economic policy in many respects. International economics, um, where the United States had assumed and kind of consolidated wealth for itself. It wanted to hold on to that and used tariffs in order to achieve it. But now we're seeing chickens come home to roost as far as what effect that's going to have on American producers of either agricultural products or manufactured goods. European economies began eroding in the late 1920s. Okay, just got a couple minutes before the cutoff here, so I'll start to get into this and then pick it up in the next segment. Again, without international trade, German manufacturing couldn't sell goods in order to repay its reparations. And so Germany began to just simply rely on printing money. And when you do that, you're going to increase inflation. And we saw examples of just how ludicrous that was, even as early as 1923. You just print off money, you hand it over to meet the obligations that you have as far as debts are concerned, but that currency, because there's so much of it in circulation, is virtually worthless. So that gets us to the actual crash of 1929, which is what I'll pick up with on the in the next segment. So stay tuned.